A U.S. Navy warship fired on an Iranian tanker in the Persian Gulf. Hours earlier, Iran formally declared control over the world's most critical oil choke point. And while diplomats were trading one-page peace memos through Pakistani intermediaries, Tehran was executing its own citizens at a rate not seen in a generation. Peace talks and gunfire, handshakes and hangings. So here's the question no one in the mainstream media is asking tonight. Can a deal signed in desperation actually hold? This is day 68 of the most consequential conflict the Middle East has seen since 2003. The United States and Iran are closer to a deal than at any point since the war began on February 28th. But today, right now, as you watch this, Iran is expected to deliver its formal response to a U.S. peace memorandum. And what Tehran says in the next few hours will either open a path back from the brink or hand Donald Trump the justification he needs to escalate this war to a level that makes the last 10 weeks look like a warm-up. In this video, we are going to cover three things that the mainstream news cycle is not giving you enough context to understand. First, what is actually in this peace proposal and why Iran's red lines make agreement incredibly difficult. Second, what has been happening inside Iran during these negotiations that should alarm every human rights observer on the planet? And third, what the realistic scenarios look like from here and which one is most likely. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. This one is moving fast. On the morning of May 7th, 2026, the world woke up to a situation that can only be described as controlled chaos. Iran was reviewing a one-page U.S. peace memorandum. Sources with direct knowledge of the talks told CNN that Tehran was expected to deliver its formal response today, bringing both sides closer to what officials called a short memorandum, a brief framework document that would declare an end to hostilities and trigger a 30-day negotiation window to settle the harder issues. But at the same time, the U.S. military fired on an Iranian-flagged tanker attempting to reach an Iranian port, enforcing the naval blockade that has been in place since April 13th. Iran, in a defiant parallel move, announced a new body it said would govern maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, asserting formal control over a waterway that the entire global economy depends on. And in Beirut, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu authorized the first strike in the Lebanese capital since the ceasefire there was declared, targeting a senior Hezbollah commander, sending a signal to Tehran that Israel's war posture has not softened, regardless of what any peace paper says. Three simultaneous acts: diplomacy, naval force, and airstrikes, all within 24 hours. That is where we are. To understand today, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. That was the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei along with dozens of senior military and government officials. It was a decapitation strike, the kind of operation military planners game plan for decades without ever executing. On that day, they executed it. Iran's response was immediate and severe. Ballistic missiles and drone swarms targeted U.S. military bases across the Middle East. Iranian proxies activated in Iraq and Yemen. But the most consequential action was economic. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply transits. Global oil prices spiked overnight. Insurance rates for shipping in the region became prohibitive. Within weeks, supply chain disruptions were rippling into energy markets from Tokyo to London. Trump's initial posture was maximalist. On March 6th, he posted that there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. On March 9th, he falsely claimed the Iranian military had been destroyed. On April 1st, he said the U.S. was blasting Iran back to the Stone Ages. Each statement was contradicted within days by Iranian missile strikes that were very much still ongoing. Pakistan stepped into the vacuum. Islamabad's army chief, General Asim Munir, began shuttling between Washington and Tehran, eventually producing a 2-week ceasefire announced on April 8th. That ceasefire held just long enough to fracture. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade on April 13th after the Islamabad talks collapsed. And now, with the blockade costing Iran an estimated $500 million daily, both sides have powerful incentives to talk, but almost no trust to work with. Before we get to the key players, remember the detail we opened with? Iran executing 28 people in 7 weeks, the fastest political execution rate in its modern history. We are going to come back to that because it tells you something about the Iranian government's state of mind at this exact negotiating table, and it is not reassuring. 5 people hold the fate of this conflict in their hands right now. Donald Trump is the central figure on the American side. He is the one who authorized the February strikes. He is the one who set the maximalist opening demands. And he is the one who told PBS News this week that any deal would require Iran to ship its enriched uranium stockpile to the United States and pledge not to operate its underground nuclear facilities. Trump's political incentives are real. He wants a win, and ending a Middle East war would be a historic one. But he has also shown repeatedly in this conflict that he is willing to threaten annihilation and then soften within the same news cycle. Abbas Araghchi is Iran's foreign minister and its chief negotiator. He has maintained throughout this process that Iran's nuclear enrichment program is non-negotiable. He has also conditioned any broader peace deal on a halt to Israel's military operations in Lebanon, a condition Israel will not accept. Araghchi is operating in an environment where his government has just lost its supreme leader, where internal factions are competing for power, and where the streets of Tehran are filled with nationalistic energy that makes capitulation politically dangerous. General Asim Munir, Pakistan's army chief, is arguably the most important figure in this drama that most Western viewers cannot name. Pakistan has become the sole diplomatic bridge between Washington and Tehran. Munir negotiated the April 8th ceasefire directly. He is currently the channel through which the U.S. proposal was delivered and through which Iran's response will travel. Benjamin Netanyahu sits in a peculiar position. He is not a party to the current U.S.-Iran talks, but he has 4 clear red lines he has communicated to Washington. Iran must dismantle its enrichment infrastructure. Its ballistic missile program must be restricted. Hezbollah and Hamas must not be rebuilt, and Iran must receive no political legitimacy from the deal. Netanyahu's authorization of the Beirut strike on May 6th, the first since the Lebanon ceasefire, was not a coincidence. It was a signal. Steve Witkoff and J.D. Vance have both been involved in the back-channel architecture of these negotiations, reflecting the Trump White House's preference for parallel diplomatic tracks that bypass traditional State Department processes. On the streets of Tehran Wednesday night, thousands gathered in what state media framed as a rally of support for the government. But the atmosphere was complicated. Mourners holding photographs of the killed Supreme Leader Khamenei marched alongside nationalists chanting, "Down with Israel." Music played, phone lights swayed, and ordinary Iranians, speaking to reporters, expressed a strikingly defiant, almost disbelieving sentiment about Trump. One woman told Reuters she did not think the United States would attack again. Another declared Iran the winner of the war. It is important to sit with that for a moment. 70 days into a conflict that killed their supreme leader and devastated their military infrastructure, significant numbers of Iranian citizens are framing this as a national victory. That tells you something about the information environment inside Iran and about the political constraints facing the Iranian government at the negotiating table. At sea, the situation remained kinetic. The U.S. Navy intercepted an Iranian-flagged tanker attempting to reach an Iranian port. This was not a diplomatic gesture. It was a live enforcement of a blockade that has, according to U.S. Central Command figures, intercepted at least 33 vessels and seized 3 ships. Iran, in retaliation, has seized 2 cargo ships of its own. Iran also announced a new maritime governance body for the Strait of Hormuz, a unilateral declaration that traffic through the strait will in the future reflect what Tehran called a new balance of power and security considerations in the region, with Iran and Oman as central authorities. This is Iran attempting to permanently institutionalize its claim over the waterway. It is not a temporary wartime measure. It is a strategic declaration of permanent intent. But here is the part no one is talking about. and it changes everything. Iran did not just close the Strait of Hormuz as a war measure. It is now trying to legally and institutionally own it. Even if a peace deal is signed tomorrow, Iran's claim to control global oil shipping does not disappear from the table. That is the hidden variable in every scenario from here forward. If you are finding this analysis valuable, subscribe now. We are just getting to the most important part of this story. The world is watching this unfold with a combination of hope and strategic self-interest. Global markets rallied on Wednesday as news of progress in U.S.-Iran talks spread. Oil prices fell, a direct reflection of investor expectation that a deal could reopen the strait and normalize energy flows. Stock markets in Europe and Asia moved higher. The economic calculation is simple. Every day the strait stays closed, global energy costs remain elevated, inflation pressure builds, and economic uncertainty compounds. France made a notable military move on Wednesday. The aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and its escort group crossed the Suez Canal, heading toward the southern Red Sea. France's defense ministry stated this was part of a 40-plus nation multinational initiative aimed at restoring free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Paris was careful to note that the carrier group's movement was separate from ongoing combat operations, but the presence of a French nuclear-powered carrier approaching the region is not a casual gesture. China has stayed largely in the background of this conflict, but its interests are immense. China is Iran's largest oil customer. A prolonged Hormuz closure damages Chinese energy security directly. Beijing has pushed Pakistan's mediation efforts diplomatically, but has not inserted itself militarily, a posture of maximum influence with minimum exposure. Russia has watched with quiet satisfaction. Higher oil prices from the Hormuz closure have helped offset some of the economic pressure Russia faces from Western sanctions. Moscow has offered no meaningful diplomatic engagement in this crisis. The United Nations Security Council has been effectively paralyzed, a predictable outcome given the involvement of a permanent member. Here is what the diplomatic coverage is missing. While the world focuses on the one-page memorandum and whether Iran will sign it, Iran is conducting the most intense political crackdown in its recent history. At least 28 people have been put to death on political, protest-related, or espionage charges in just 7 weeks, according to a U.S.-based human rights organization tracking executions. 28 people, 7 weeks. That is a rate exceeding 4 executions per week on political grounds, a pace that surpasses anything documented in Iran's modern history. This is not a footnote. It is the story beneath the story. It tells you that the Iranian government, even as it negotiates a potential peace deal with Washington, is engaged in a simultaneous internal war against anyone it perceives as a threat to its survival. People accused of passing information to the United States, people who protested in the street, people who questioned the leadership's decisions. And then there is the second hidden angle, the inconsistency in Iran's own peace proposals. Iran released multiple versions of its 14-point counterproposal with small but meaningful differences between the Persian language and English language texts. These discrepancies were flagged by analysts tracking the negotiations. What do they mean? At minimum, they suggest internal fracture. Different factions within the Iranian government pushing different versions of what Iran is willing to accept. At worst, they suggest deliberate strategic ambiguity, keeping all parties uncertain about exactly what Tehran has actually agreed to. A government that executes dissidents while simultaneously releasing contradictory versions of its peace proposals is not a stable negotiating partner. That reality has to be factored into every scenario analysis from this point forward. Remember what we said at the top. The question was not whether a deal is possible. The question was whether a deal signed in this environment can actually hold. Because a government cracking down this hard internally while managing contradictory external messaging, that is not a government that has resolved its internal crisis. That is a government under existential pressure. And that changes the risk calculus entirely. Subscribe if you haven't already. What comes next is where this story either resolves or becomes something much larger. Let us be direct about what is at stake here because the numbers are staggering. The Strait of Hormuz is a 21-mile-wide choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Every day it remains closed or contested. Approximately 17 to 21 million barrels of oil that would normally flow through it do not reach global markets through normal channels. Oil-dependent economies, from Japan to Germany to South Korea, are absorbing sustained energy cost increases. The blockade is estimated to be costing Iran itself roughly $500 million daily in lost export revenue. That is an enormous economic weapon aimed at both sides. If this war escalates, if Iran rejects the U.S. proposal, and Trump follows through on his threat of higher level and intensity strikes, the targets would almost certainly include Iranian power infrastructure, bridges, and potentially its remaining nuclear facilities. The humanitarian consequences inside Iran would be catastrophic, and the risk of miscalculation, drawing in other regional actors, rises exponentially. If the deal holds, but Iran retains its institutional claim over the Strait of Hormuz, the world faces a long-term restructuring of global energy security. Shipping insurance, navigation rights, and regional military posture would all need to be renegotiated around the reality of Iranian maritime authority in the Gulf. That is a permanent change to the architecture of the global economy. And the Lebanon variable cannot be ignored. Iran has made any comprehensive peace deal conditional on a halt to Israel's military operations in Lebanon. Israel has refused. Netanyahu struck Beirut on May 6th. If Lebanon reignites fully while a U.S.-Iran deal is being negotiated, the deal collapses. That is not a low-probability scenario. It is a live and active risk. Analysts tracking this conflict are divided into two broad camps. The first camp argues that both sides now have overwhelming incentives to reach a deal. Iran's economy is under severe strain. The blockade and sanctions together are creating conditions that could destabilize the government more effectively than any airstrike. The United States, meanwhile, is entering a midterm election cycle with a war it has not been able to definitively win. Oil prices elevated and public fatigue building. From this view, a deal is not just likely, it is the only rational outcome for both leaderships. The second camp, and this view is gaining traction among strategic analysts, argues that the structural obstacles are too large to bridge with a one-page memorandum. Iran will not surrender its nuclear enrichment program. That is not a negotiating position. It is a red line with domestic, political, and existential weight behind it. Al Jazeera's correspondent reporting from Tehran noted explicitly that Iranian officials view enrichment as non-negotiable. The U.S., under Trump's stated terms, requires Iran to ship its enriched uranium to American custody. These two positions cannot coexist in a single document. Israeli analysts add a further constraint. Jerusalem has been briefed on the current negotiations and is pushing back hard. Netanyahu's four conditions: end enrichment, restrict missiles, deny Hamas and Hezbollah reconstruction, no political legitimacy for Tehran, are essentially a demand that Iran accept the strategic outcome of a war it believes it did not lose. The streets of Tehran, where crowds declared Iran the winner, reflect exactly why the Iranian government cannot accept those terms politically. The most likely near-term outcome, according to analysts surveying the landscape, is a limited interim agreement. Not a comprehensive peace deal, but a framework that pauses active hostilities, addresses the immediate Hormuz crisis, and defers the harder nuclear and regional security questions to a future multi-party negotiation. Think less peace deal, more structured pause with high collapse risk. Remember the question we started with? Can a deal signed in desperation actually hold? Here is what we now know. And it is more complicated than even the pessimists expected. The obstacle is not the willingness to talk. Both sides are talking. The obstacle is that both sides are telling their own people they are winning. And in a negotiation where both parties claim victory, someone has to be wrong. The moment that becomes clear to their respective domestic audiences is the moment this deal fractures. Three scenarios are now on the table. Best case, Iran delivers a positive response to the U.S. memorandum on May 7th. The two sides agree to a structured 30-day negotiation window. The naval blockade is eased. Hormuz traffic normalizes. Oil prices fall sharply. A broader multilateral framework involving Pakistan, possibly China, and potentially European partners begins drafting a longer-term regional security agreement. The Lebanon issue is separated from the Iran-U.S. track and addressed in a parallel ceasefire process. The nuclear question is deferred for 90 to 180 days under a monitoring framework. This is possible. It is not the most likely outcome. Likely case. Iran's response on May 7th is partial, neither a full acceptance nor a flat rejection, but a counterproposal that accepts some elements of the U.S. memorandum while insisting on modifications to the nuclear and Lebanon provisions. Talks continue under Pakistani mediation. The blockade remains in place, but enforcement is selectively eased to allow some humanitarian shipping. The situation settles into a tense diplomatic limbo, fragile, contested, and subject to collapse from any number of triggers, including Israeli military action in Lebanon. This extends the conflict into the summer without a clear resolution path. Worst case, Iran rejects the U.S. proposal outright, citing its non-negotiable red lines on nuclear enrichment and Lebanon. Trump follows through on his threat of higher level and intensity strikes. U.S. air power targets Iranian power infrastructure, bridges, and nuclear facilities. Iran responds by mining the Strait of Hormuz and launching sustained missile campaigns against U.S. regional bases. The conflict escalates beyond anything seen in the first 70 days. Oil markets go into crisis. The humanitarian situation inside Iran becomes catastrophic. Regional actors, including Hezbollah, Houthi forces in Yemen, and Iraqi militia groups, activate simultaneously. This remains the tail risk, but it is not small. Now we want to hear from you because this story is genuinely contested and your perspective matters. Here's the first question. Do you believe diplomacy can still produce a durable deal here? Not a temporary pause, not a paper ceasefire, a real, lasting agreement that addresses the nuclear question, the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran's regional influence, all at once. Because many serious analysts say that is asking for too much in too little time. And the second question, the executions. 28 people in 7 weeks. Does a government conducting wartime purges of its own citizens deserve the sanctions relief and unfrozen assets that the U.S. is reportedly willing to offer as part of this deal? Or does diplomatic engagement with a government in the middle of a political crackdown represent something the world should not normalize? Tell us where you stand in the comments below. This is the kind of conversation that rarely happens in mainstream coverage, and it needs to. 3 things you must take from this video. First, the one-page memorandum on the table today is not a peace deal. It is an agreement to start negotiating a peace deal. The hard questions about Iran's nuclear program, the Strait of Hormuz, and Lebanon are all deferred. The document's value is as a circuit breaker, not a solution. Do not let the diplomatic optimism of the last 48 hours cause you to mistake a pause for a resolution. Second, Iran's wartime crackdown, 28 executions in 7 weeks, is the hidden story of this entire conflict. Whatever happens at the diplomatic table, a government moving that fast against its own people is a government under pressure that has not stabilized. That instability is a factor in every scenario from here. Third, Israel is the variable that everyone in the U.S.-Iran negotiating track is trying to manage but cannot control. Netanyahu struck Beirut on May 6th. He has 4 conditions that Iran cannot publicly accept. As long as the Lebanon front remains hot, a comprehensive peace deal is structurally impossible. This story is not over. What happens in the next 72 hours? Iran's formal response, Trump's reaction, and Israel's next move could change everything. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it, and we will give you the context no one else is. In wars decided by one-page memos, the footnotes are where the truth lives.